In the Middle Ages, if you failed in business and went bankrupt, you would spend the rest of your life paying off your debts. It wasn't just about losing money, it was about losing the weight of your reputation. Failure wasn't a business event, it was a complete denial of one's character. It wasn't just economic bankruptcy, it was a moral breach of contract, a shackle that would stay with you forever. So, when we stand in this world today, watching someone legally declare bankruptcy, close their company, and walk away unscathed, or even start a new business, one question cannot be avoided. What exactly happened that transformed failure from a lifelong stain into a controllable option? In 1855, the British Parliament passed the Limited Liability Act. History is written with restraint. It states, shareholders and companies are now legally separated. The consequences of corporate bankruptcy are no longer borne by the shareholders' private assets. This was to encourage investment, to diversify risk, and to promote industrial development. These statements are true, but they only address the surface benefits, deliberately ignoring the structural costs. Because this law did not make the world safer. It merely redistributed who bore the risks. What limited liability truly created was not a new system, but a new species. A legal entity, it can expand infinitely, accumulate wealth, create disasters, but will never be dragged to the gallows. A company is neither a person nor a machine. It is more like armor blessed by law. A person, once inside, can wield a sword, set fires, and when the battlefield becomes ruins, the armor will shield him from judgment. Limited liability is not about reducing liability, but about separating liability from the person and entrusting it to a shell that feels no pain. Understanding limited liability must begin with a seemingly trivial question. What is risk in its original sense? In pre-modern societies, risk was a continuous chain of cause and effect. Judgment, action, consequences, the rest of one's life. If you gambled wrong, it wasn't just losing money, but rather you as a person have been proven wrong. Limited liability, like a scalpel, precisely severed this chain of cause and effect. It told society, the action may be yours, the profit may be yours, but disaster, we redistribute it. When the worst consequences are limited, when failure is no longer a life-altering event, capital begins to flow on a large scale for the first time. Strangers begin to trust strangers. Stocks begin to change hands like paper. Investing no longer requires courage, only probability. This is the moment capitalism truly accelerates. When risk is confined to the balance sheet, capital begins to run at an unprecedented speed. But the cost is, risk, from an experience of existence, degenerates into a line of numbers. When risk becomes a variable in a model, it loses its moral weight. Limited liability never appeared quietly. From its inception, it immediately sparked fierce debate. Interestingly, those who supported it almost universally sided with the idea that capital needs freedom, while those who opposed it instinctively sensed a loosening of a moral framework. John Stuart Mill, one of the most rational and restrained voices in the liberal tradition, explicitly defended limited liability. His logic was remarkably clear. If every investment failure means personal destruction, then rational people will no longer be willing to invest. In Mill's view, limited liability was not indulgence, but rather controlling risk within a calculable range, thus directing capital towards production rather than hoarding it in the dungeons. Adam Smith himself, although living in an era before limited liability was institutionalized, subtly foresaw the allure of this structure in the wealth of nations. His assessment of joint stock companies was not romantic. He warned managers that they were more prone to negligence, but also acknowledged that without a shareholding system, businesses of certain sizes simply could not exist. This is a cool-headed realism. If you want scale, you have to accept that personality is diluted. But dissenting voices never disappeared. Karl Marx didn't specifically include clauses on limited liability, but his critique of the anonymization of capital almost precisely hit its nail on the head. In his view, the joint stock company is a depersonalized form of capital. When everyone only bears a small portion of the risk, no one is truly responsible for the whole. This concern was later repeatedly emphasized by a more sober and harder-to-ignore thinker. Frank Knight, one of the founders of modern risk theory, clearly distinguished between calculable risk and true uncertainty. He pointed out, limited liability only applies to the former, but systematically dumps the latter on society. You can use models to calculate the probability of bankruptcy, but you cannot calculate how many lives a systemic collapse will devour. If we temporarily set aside abstract ethics and ask only a cold, hard question, who does this system reward systematically and in the long run? The answer isn't complicated. First layer of beneficiaries. Shareholders. Shareholders enjoy a highly asymmetrical structure. They have an upper limit to returns, but avoid a lower limit to consequences. This isn't a moral criticism, but a mathematical fact. Second layer of beneficiaries. Top decision makers. When decision makers don't need to use their personal assets to bail out systemic failures, their risk appetite subtly changes. Not because they become more greedy, but because the system rewards darker bets. Limited liability here becomes a psychological incentive mechanism. So, who pays the bill? This question is often cleverly obscured by the language of the system. First layer of victims, creditors, especially those creditors who lack the ability to diversify risk, suppliers, employees, small partners. They have a real relationship with the company, yet are forced to bear the real impact of the company's failure. Second layer of victims, taxpayers. When a company is too big to fail, limited liability undergoes a strange reversal. The failure of private enterprises translates into a burden on public finances. Risk is re-socialized. A few fail, everyone pays the price. If you recall the 2008 financial crisis, the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve bailout AIG, one of the world's largest insurance groups with approximately $182 billion, simply because it sold a large number of credit default swaps, CDS, and was unable to redeem them. The third layer of victims, future generations. This is the most silent group. Inflation, debt, environmental damage, financial instability. These won't be immediately resolved, but will slowly erode future choices. Limited liability bills don't require the present generation to pay in full at once. Limited liability is not merely a legal technique, but a mechanism that systematically breaks down the ratio of rights to obligations. In traditional societies, rights and obligations are positively correlated. In the limited liability structure, rights are unlimited, obligations are limited. This is a quiet yet profound revolution. You gain decision-making power, the right to profits and the right to expand, but no longer need to bear the equivalent consequences. This is not personal misconduct, but a structural design. People like to blame crises on greedy executives and unscrupulous capitalists. This is psychologically understandable and politically convenient, but it avoids the truly disturbing fact. Even well-intentioned, rational and law-abiding individuals within a limited liability structure can be pushed to more dangerous decision-making boundaries. The system here is more important than character. Limited liability is not a mistake. It is a success. Its birth ushered in the prosperity of modern capitalism, creating countless great companies. Precisely because it succeeded to the extreme, it exposed the deepest paradox of capitalism. We used a system that liberated productive forces, creating a force unable to fully bear the consequences. Capital learned to expand, but no longer needed to be responsible for its collapse. The real danger isn't the phrase limited liability. It's when a society becomes accustomed to enjoying rights while forgetting the weight of obligations. Because risk isn't eliminated by law, it will simply wait patiently and, in places you can't see, find someone weaker to fulfill its obligations.